Welcome everyone to this week's Cat's Eye on the Future. This week, I'm happy to have back my regular guest Kvelduflr, Gundarsson, and today we're going to talk about a really popular topic, that of wolves in the Germanic tradition. Over to you, Kvelduflr.
Yes, well, actually, both wolves and dogs, since if you've ever met any of the northern dog breeds, you'll probably know that there's not a lot of difference between them. Usually the dogs have collars on. That's how you tell the difference. Okay, but the wolf's an interesting and very ambiguous figure in the Norse. It's seldom seen in items likely to be amuletic or magical, with a few exceptions, such as the wolf dancer images, who often appear together with the guy in the bird-horned helmet, as in the Kungsängen grave in Viking Age Sweden, or the Migration Age Torslunda Helmplate matrices. I think these are probably more closely related to the Odinic cult and to the general Berserk or Ulfhednar thing. Ulfhednar literally meaning wolf-coated, and this group of people were Harald or Herfer's shock troops, as described in Kraftsmal. Berserk, we're still debating whether it means Bearsark as in without armor or clothes, or Bearsark as in wearing the hide of a bear. In any case, that belongs to an entirely different class of iconography than the simple use of the animal, which is probably due to the overall dark to ambiguous view of the wolves. All the wolves of the other world, including and perhaps especially Odin's pair, are seen as beasts of death and destruction, undoubtedly to their very real nature, which our forebears had the opportunity to observe on a reasonably regular basis as eaters of the dead. De Vries remarks that the wolf became particularly feared as a demonic being of the wilderness, as the eater of both the lone traveler and the slain on the battlefield, and possibly inclined to exhume graves that were dug a little too hastily, which may have something to do with why it was so very popular to either cremate your dead, or if you were burying them, put them in big mounds, big cairns with lots of stones on them, that sort of things. T.S. Eliot said, "Oh, keep the dog far hence that's friend to men, or with his nails he'll dig it up again." And this is pretty natural practice for canids of all sorts, including Spot over there sleeping by your fire or heater, if he had the chance. De Vries also cites in the demonic being relevance Fenrir, the Etten wolves who chase sun and moon, the wolves born to the Hag of Ironwood in Volusbau, and the curse formula for an oath-breaker who shall be, quote, thus far wolfish, peaceless, and cursed, as far as men hunt wolves. To this one might also add the wolf-riding troll women of Helga Kvida Hjörvardssonar, Harald Saga Sigurðarsonar, and Hurricane, who shows up riding her wolf at Baldur's funeral, as well as Fro Heckel of later German folklore, who rides on a wolf at the head of a host of witches shooting arrows from their fingers, and those of you who are up on your saga might in fact recall the Deeser of the Hallegar Jarls also doing the shooting missiles from their fingers thing to protect him, and also the wolf-riding woman from the Hunnestad monument. There's a wolf or hound on the battle scene on the Klintahunga one picture stone, and the Valhut reception scene of the Alskog Changvida one picture stone. Although the Alskog Changvida animal is decidedly more hound-like than wolf-like, it's got a very long, narrow tail on it. Ears look a bit on the floppy side. And if it's in proportion to the other features, it's probably more likely to be a large breed, such as the Irish Wolfhound, which was known at the time, and undoubtedly much appreciated in Scandinavia as well at the time, given the amount of interaction. Both of these picture stones could be meant to show the wolf or possibly dog, as the devourer of the slain and the wolf as Odin's hound, though it's quite possible that Allskog Tiengvita 1 is meant to show the earthly noble hall with all its fittings, including an atheling hound, as mirrored in the world of the gods. When Fylgir appear as wolves or dogs in dreams and visions, they're usually seen in groups rather than as individuals, which is odd considering how popular wolf was at Ulfr as either a name or a name element. But in dreams, they usually appear as a warning of gathering enemies, as in Harthar Saga, where Thorbjorn dreams of a pack of wolves led by a white bear, and Hvarthar Saga Isfjordings, where the foes, who are directed by a wizard, are seen as a pack of wolves led by a vixen. The Anglo-Saxon dream book De Somnoria Eventu also says, if he thinks he sees hounds and they bay him, let him be on guard against his enemies. And the wolf as the generic symbol of somebody who is an enemy can also be seen in the rede given to Sigurd there by Sigurd Rifa. Never trust the oath of a Varg son, Vargdrapi, whether you have been brother's bane or you have felled father. A wolf is in a young son, although he is glad of gold. And that, of course, is referring specifically to the danger of deadly foeship and revenge, even if a weregild is paid. The wolf was feared enough, in fact, to be given several taboo names. The most usual of these are the variants of Warg, Vargar, outlaw, perhaps stemming from the use of the Warg word for corpse robber in some of the earliest continental Germanic law codes, likening the robber of corpses to the canid that digs up and devours the corpses, or devours them even without having to dig them up after a battle. Or perhaps from the often-spoken likeness between a criminal cast out of all human society to live in the woods and a wolf living wild in the woods, which may possibly suggest that our forebears weren't always as grade A in studying nature as we like to think of them as having been, as most people who know wolves in the wild will be aware that they're actually incredibly social. And a wolf living in the woods is likely to be living in the woods with his or her mates, siblings, children, and other relatives, all working very happily together and not getting a lot of privacy. It's not a big thing among wolves.
I have a question on the naming and the name Ulf being popular or Ulfr and yet it being an enemy. Would this sort of be like, I know even until relatively recent times there was often a tradition to name children after a worthy enemy.
I don't think that's likely. I think and I'm going to discuss this later, but in short, I think what we're seeing there is a combination of the wolf as totem being, because people, especially in a culture with a strong warrior element, tend to attach to clan totems who are predators, and also there is just a tendency for warriors to individually identify with predators. So we have that on the one hand, and on the other hand we have the general fear of the wolf. Back to the Vargar word, Jacobi came to the conclusion that Vargar, being itself quite a mighty, if unfriendly word with otherworldly overtones, probably was not actually a taboo name, since one would really no more want to summon a warg or outlaw than one would want to summon a wolf, but rather meant to be an insult to the wolf from Viking Age poetic usage. However, given the strong later tradition of taboo names for wolves, especially at holy times, which I discuss in a few moments, I'm less than convinced by his argument. Regardless, the word Vargar was so often used for a wolf in Scandinavia that it replaced the wolf word Ulfr entirely in modern Swedish and Norwegian. In both languages, if you go to a nature park somewhere like Skansen, you will go and you will look at vargs. But it doesn't replace it in Danish. The word remains Ulv in Danish and Ulfr in Icelandic, suggesting possibly that the danger from wolves was a good bit greater in the large forests and wild mountains of Sweden and Norway than in Denmark, which is, kind of a flat and tamish island, and Iceland, which is entirely devoid of any wolves that didn't come with their masters wagging their tails and barking their little heads off. Certainly the Icelanders had no reason to worry about wolves eating their livestock or children's. Now, I've already cited the Swedish taboo names for the three beasts of battle in previous interviews, I believe. The wolf, the raven, and the eagle. It was believed in 18th century Sweden that it was especially dangerous to even mention the name Varg during the Yule nights. You have to call it Odur, unbeast or monster, or the Grey One. Grimm also cites the German superstition that shepherds must not name the wolf during the Yule nights, or he will worry their sheep. Again, the Yule, the doors to the other world, are particularly open, and, well, if you call something, it just might come to you, whether you want it to or not. Now, Jacobi notes further that both warg and wolf become common names or comparisons for the Christian devil and or damned souls after the conversion. And I suggest that rather than a Christian tainting of either word or animal, this represents a pretty clear case of Christianity taking a native understanding and readapting it in order to convey its own message. I think the fear of the wolf and revulsion for the warg were already firmly set in Germanic thought well before the first Christians ever crossed the Rhine. In this regard, Pluskowski comments that despite early arguments that Fenrir's role at Ragnarok in particular could have been influenced by the Christian beasts of Revelation, he suggests that conceptualizing an apocalyptic force in the form of a wolf was distinctly northern and pagan. The recurring lupine thing of Ragnarok sets it apart from the monsters of Revelation ultimately derived from Middle Eastern traditions. He further observes that the wolf as a devilish beast in Christian imagery did not seem to hold a particularly special place. Leopard, bear, fox, boar, and onager all received like comparisons in medieval bestiaries, and the forms preferred by medieval Christian demons were dogs, snakes or dragons, and goats. Now, the Old Norse literature continues this theme of the wolf as the most symbolically antisocial of beasts, regardless of how they act in the wild. In Ynglinga Saga, when the old advisor Svipdagur, who is almost certainly an Odin figure, gives the young prince Ingjaldr a wolf's heart to eat in order to make a man of him, Ingjaldr becomes, quote, grimmest and worst-tempered of all men, unquote. Fierce, cruel, and untrustworthy, the most savage and ill-famed of the Yngling line. The understanding of the wolf as dangerously antisocial also appears in Atlakvitha in Grimninska 8, where Gudrun, to warn her brothers that Atli is lying and means to murder them, winds a wolf's hair around the ring she sends them. The wolf is also used in this poem as the image of the desolation that will overtake the Niflingar if Gunnar Gjukesson does not come back. The wolf shall rule the Niflingar inheritance, the old Grey Warder, if Gunnar is lost. Likewise, the Anglo-Saxon Deor tells us that we have heard of Jormrik's wolfish mind. Widely he ruled the folk of the Gothic realm. He was a cruel king. And part of Loki's punishment for mouthing off at Lokasenna is to have one of his sons transformed to a wolf, whereupon the wolf rips out the bowels of his brother and runs out into the wild lands, described in the prose at the end of Lokasenna. We don't know when this came in, but it seems plausible enough. And this is a very literal picture of the curse of kinslaying and outlawry. In a like situation, the dying Hreithmar, slain by his son Fafnir, before Fafnir turns into a dragon, bids his daughter Lingheather to see to his vengeance, and when she refuses, he calls her Dis Ulfhugud, the wolf-souled or hearted or thoughted Idis. The word Vargdroppy, wolf-dropping, appears as a legal term for the son of an outlaw in Graugas, as well as the Sigurd Rifumalverse I mentioned earlier, and also implied bastardry. So given this view of the wolf, as we summarized briefly earlier, It might be thought very odd that Ulfr and other wolf names such as Thorolfr or Adolf and so forth, could sit here probably listing them most of the hour, are seen so very, very often in Germanic culture and all through Germanic culture. All of the languages have the Ulfr related or wolf compound names very frequently in them. Now, as I said, this may spring from an early use of the wolf as a clan totem, as with the Wolfing or Ilfingkin, and I'll just briefly mention an item found in England, the Undly Bracteate, which shows the Romulus and Remus suckling the she-wolf image from the Roman coin from which it was derived, a head on the other side, the original of which was a female head in a helmet changed to a male head on the Undly Bracteate, and bears an inscription which seems to refer to a female wolf. And it's very possible that this was being used to emphasize the authority of the wolfing line at that time. Otherwise, De Vries suggests that the wolf and raven elements may well have been substitutions for Odin's own name, which appears very, very, very seldom in personal names. I think we have 2 Odin Kars, at least one of them well after the conversion. He's a bishop down in Denmark, and the Swedish woman's name Odin Dis, which is no more frequent. Or that the wolf names, like the by names Ulfhedin and Ulfhammer, Wolfcoat and Wolfhide, were first linked with the Berserk cult. Pluskowski also marks that whether opponent or servant, conflated or splintered, there appears to have been a consistent association between wolves and battle gods in pre-Christian Scandinavia. The association between a predatory deity or group of predatory deities and the battlefield to express elite martial identity, those warriors identifying with predatory animals, either personally or through a deity, effectively converted themselves into predators and their enemies into prey. And if you want to, successfully go out and kill your enemy and, possibly come home with whatever he had on him at the time as your prize, that's a pretty good way to look at it. It would also nicely fit with the wolf names and warrior kennings, which have slayers, quote, feeding the wolves, unquote, and raptors, the beasts of battle, as well as the use of the wolf hide for Harald or Herfair's elite Ulfhednar, and the almost certainly related imagery of the wolf-skinned warrior that I mentioned. Now, as I said, neither dogs nor wolves often appear as shaped amulets, but there's a few interesting pieces which appear in art and may or may not have been amuletic. It's always difficult to tell without a very direct context and a few obvious signs. I think probably my favorite piece of art, most likely in this context, is a piece from Viking Dublin, from Fishamble Street, which is a dog or a wolf with ball. It's a wooden toggle of some sort, and it shows a canine curled around a sphere held in its impressive jaws. It's probably the most realistic wolf or dog seen anywhere in Viking Age art. It's often read as a dog playing with a ball, and if that's the case, it is a rather ferocious-looking dog. But it's just as likely, I think, that it could show Skut or Hati eating the sun or moon, in which case the chance that it was used as an amulet is pretty well nil. The Sutton Hoo purse lid is adorned with 2 matching cloisonné garnet figures, which seem to show a man seated between 2 wolves. Now, it's tempting to see this as Odin, or rather, in Anglo-Saxon Woden, with his wolves Yeri and Freki, although its close likeness to the Velskjærde 7-man between bears helm plate and the same overall design on the Torslunde warrior with 2 bears matrix calls that reading into some question, especially since the human or at least human mask between 2 animals or animal heads is a very common motif in the Viking Age. In any case, I think the piece is more likely to have been decorative than amuletic. mentioned in the lecture on bears, the Torslunda matrix, which shows a man with an axe and a beast on a lead. And I think looking at the tail in the contrast to the other Torslunda matrix, where the critters are certainly bears, the guy with the axe and the beast is probably a large hound. Again, very likely an Irish wolfhound. It's got that long whippy wolfhound tail on it. And if so, it could represent an offering. It could represent part of a ritual in which the hound played a part, perhaps taking the place of an actual wild wolf. Or the valuable, rare, imported, large breed of special hound with its armed handler may simply have been shown here as a status symbol showing off the rulership, wealth, and might of the helm's bearer. There's a small ewe head from Wolan in Poland called a dragon's head by some authors, but the proportions of muzzle and head, the strongly marked nose, laid-back pointed ears and snarl, and collar around its neck are markedly wolf-like, in my opinion, dog-like or wolf-like, far more like a canid than any of our clearer renditions of the admittedly unstandardized Nordic worm. The Wolan animal head is thought to have probably been meant for an attachment to a box in the manner of the animal's heads on the rather spectacular Hammond casket. If so, it might have been meant as a ward or warning against anyone or anything who would steal the contents, which is a pretty reasonable use for a dog or a wolf, and probably the most likely amuletic use of a canine image. Likewise, there's a bronze head from the end of an unprovenanced 10th century Danish harnish bow, which is decidedly canine in appearance, complete with carefully marked canine fangs and smaller chewing teeth. Rosedal and Wilson comment that its shape as an animal head with bear's teeth presumably has an apotropaic significance. Again, this use of the image as a guardian, a protector. The Moseyard harness bow has very similar heads on the end, although the ears are more rounded, more like those of an ordinary dog rather than a wolf or Nordic wolf dog. But again, this use of the dog wolf, it would fit very well with the casket wolves or dogs, and makes perfect sense as a wolf or dog warding amulet. On a 8th century English sword mount found in the Thames, the terminal head is reasonably dog-like. Again, it's possibly a greyhound type, much more greyhound-looking than wolfy-looking. And again, it's got those exaggerated canines that we see on the Danish harness bow and toggle, and on the wolfskin Kungsingen Sigmunder. Now, if it's not meant to be a dog, but rather a dragon or some form of composite beast, the gaping jaws and canine teeth are nevertheless probably drawn from the wolf or dog, and it seems quite reasonable to me that a sword mount, too, should be designed as a symbol of fierceness, warding, or both. There's a runic inscription, but unfortunately it's a very difficult one. It may be a very deeply coded version of a male personal name. Now, Gressland marks that some of the animal heads found in female graves, of which the best known are probably the Osberg head posts, though some 10th century examples have been found in Valsierde and Birka, have been interpreted as wolves. She comments that animal heads with big round eyes, open mouths, and big teeth had without doubt a symbolic meaning and gave signal of the owner's power and status to his or her entourage. Which is possible. I find it likelier that such heads were meant to have an aggressive warding use, though I can't say the Osberg head posts look at all like wolves to me. But perhaps the likeliest Viking hound amulet is the small bronze Kungsingen hound figurine found in Cremation Grave 6, together with the Kungsingen Sigmunder, the guy in the wolf skin holding what is probably a snake and about to bite into it, and the Kungsingen horn dancer. I mentioned earlier that the two images often go together. Here they were in the same grave, possibly on the same necklace, as two separate pieces, rather like a charm bracelet or such. But the hound figurine is a three-dimensional figurine. It's a bit over half an inch tall, roughly 1.45 centimeters. It's set on a bronze disc. It was obviously meant to either stand on its own or be carried in a pouch or both. and shows a tailless dog of a very short-legged, deep-chested type, recalling the Swedish Vallhund, a breed for which the latest accepted date of origin, which is the 8th century, and that's the latest, would have it already well established by the time of the burial, which was roughly 10th century, and which is naturally born from anything from the full-curled spitz tail to no tail at all. Vallhunds, other than that, they look like very short-legged elkhounds or wolf dogs. They're probably the chondroplastic version, as the dachshund is further south, whose short legs and size made it actually a very practical dog for things like herding cattle, as the name indicates. The minimized ears or earlessness, if the feature was deliberate rather than an artifact of production, and it could easily have been a casting failure, which would not be surprising for such a thin bit on a pre-electric casting, I add, might bring to mind the weird lines in Raffensmaul about Ondather's foolish play with the earless dog, but there's not really much we can take about it, since we actually are not really sure what the poet was on about there. There's been a lot of interesting suggestions there have, but there's a lot of ways one can interpret foolish play. But in any way, not sure there's much to be gained there. So in seeing the Kungsingen hound as an amulet, all the usual warnings apply. It could have just been a favorite sculpture of the woman who was buried there, maybe a portrait of an actual pet, maybe she just liked dogs, we don't know. It's also possible that it was meant to stand in for a real hound, a real guardian hound in the other world. And if it were used as an amulet, my guess would be that it would most likely have been meant as a warder, perhaps put in the cremation grave specifically to keep guarding its mistress against the wights that might seek to harm the dead. Otherwise, and we're heading way out into the misty waters of speculation here, be warned, it might also be possible here, given the context of the two pendants I've been talking about from the same grave, to see the hound figurine as linked with the imagery of the cult of Odin. Say Odin is the leader of the woad host, which frequently involves dogs and or wolves, and or the various human woad host activities of masking, dancing, and so forth. But that is only a completely wild speculation. Maybe someone else will make something more of it someday. Now, like wolves, dogs are mentioned surprisingly seldom in accounts of the god realms or otherworld. And the only named actual hound in the poetic sources is Garmr, who guards the way to hell, but he is probably closely kin conceptually to Skut and Hati, and to Yeri and Freki, all puppies of the original Indo-European dog wolf, as the embodiment of devouring death. Now, even without the knowledge gained by genetic testing, our forebears were just as aware of the closeness between dog and wolf as we are. In fact, it is almost certain that every so often a Norwegian farmer's female elkhound came home with a litter that had not been sired by his stud on the farm. She'd gone off into the woods and made it with a wolf. And this may or may not have been seen as a bad thing. Certainly in later North America, it was the custom to deliberately put out a female in heat in hopes of bringing in a bit more wolf blood to strengthen the line. But in any case, Jacobi argues that the dogs which Adam of Bremen describes as being hung with horses and men at Old Uppsala may actually have either actually been wolves or at least put up to symbolize wolves. He also suggests the same for the hounds of the woad host or wild hunt, that they may be linked with or set in place of Woden's wolves, and possibly also related to the practice of wolf masking, which survives so clearly in both the imagery and the literature, and may especially have been done at Yule when the woad host rides most strongly. It's hard to tell in regards to the later wild hunt as such, since that is generally described as a frightening otherworldly version of a perfectly normal medieval hunt, for which hounds were required, as much as horses, without necessarily reference to older beliefs. But the overall thinking seems pretty reasonable, and certainly the Yuletide wolf masking was an old part of the Woad host beliefs and practices.
You have been listening to part 1 of Cat's Eye on the Future. We'll return to the show right after these short messages. Do you have questions? The cards have answers. If you would like a personal reading with Melodi, just go to my website, melodipsychicreadings.com. That's Melodi with an I, psychicreadings.com, for information, or email me at melodireader@gmail.com. Readings are available using Skype, phone, email, or even in person if you are lucky to live in Ireland. Why not find out what special messages the cards have just for you and book a private reading today? We now return to part 2 of Cat's Eye on the Future.
Now, despite its closeness to its frightening wild sibs, the hound is our very oldest house animal. Hounds have been with the northern folk since we first followed the glaciers to Scandinavia, and largely unchanged at that. The bones of the Skataholm burial ground hounds, which are from the hunter-gatherer period of the Stone Age in Sweden, can hardly, if at all, except by carbon dating, I guess, and the fact that they're in a museum with a label on them, be told from those of the modern Norwegian elk hound. These hounds were buried like men, and were strewn with the red ochre that hallowed most of the human graves there, although some had clearly been sent to the other world to accompany their owners. Hounds of the same stocky wolf-dog type came with us in the Viking Age wherever we went, across the Middlegarth Sea to Greenland, and probably all the way to Vinland, but definitely to Greenland, we found the bones, and across the great rivers to the lands of the dead. Dogs are very common in Viking and Anglo-Saxon graves. David Wilson notes in Anglo-Saxon paganism that dogs are strongly, though not only, found with male burials. The Ladaby lead from a Viking Age ship find was branched for 4 hounds, designed so they could pretty much stand in a straight line before their owner, and they must have been very well-trained hounds, because having kept Norwegian elk hounds, I know exactly what would happen if I put a lot of them on such a lead. Though dogs are not common in Norse literature, the worth of a good dog is sometimes spoken of in the sagas. Olafur Tryggvason acquired an unusually clever, quote, large cattle dog, unquote, which he named Vigi, in Ireland, and this hound plays a major part in both Snorri's and Otter's version of Olafur's slaying of the staunchly heathen Thorir Hjörtur, Thorir the Hart, the stag. In Snorri's version, Olafur simply sets this hound on the fast-running man, and when Vigi was badly wounded in bringing the man down, Olafur had the dog carried carefully to his ship as if he had been a wounded man. Now, Otter Snorrison's version shows a more magical side. When Thorir has been speared through the chest and falls, a stag leaps up from his body and speeds away. The hound chases the spirit stag, the fleeing Vilgir or what have you, and brings him down, though being grievously wounded in the process. And when the king's men catch up, the body of the stag is already dry and light, quote, like inflated bellows, unquote. Now, this version is very, very much reminiscent of the later folklore about dogs seeing and guarding against otherworldly beings in specific, as Vigi is the one that actually is able to chase and slay and indeed even be wounded by Thorir's fetch. Vigi's breed is never stated, though his origin, his ability to bring down a large running prey, man or stag by himself, and the mention of his size, really strongly suggests the Irish wolfhound. Still, it is the Norwegian elkhound and its close kin, such as the Norwegian buhund and the Swedish Jämthund and Valhund breeds, who were the nearest and dearest to our forebears for literally 9,000 years or more. The loving troth of the elkhound has long been celebrated in Norwegian folklore, and I can vouch for it myself after many years of living with these fine hounds. Now, in regards to hounds as seers, as actual interactions with the other world and possibly foresight, the Anglo-Saxon Elfric in Lives of the Saints condemns the unchristian practice of augury, quote, either from birds or from sneezing, either from horses, which are, of course, very well known as holy animals and, ways through which the gods speak, or from dogs. Unfortunately, he says no more of this, so we don't know whether the Anglo-Saxons trusted hounds for foresight over all, or whether they, like later Scandinavians, saw dogs as chiefly foreseers of death. Now, while hounds in non-otherworldly folk tales are usually mentioned and renowned for their troth and their skills as hunters and guardians, hounds in Scandinavian folklore are strongly linked to death in both earthly and otherworldly regards, and are thought to be trusty foreseers of death in many ways. For instance, if on Yule Eve each member of the family lays a piece of buttered bread before the dog, the one whose bread the dog eats first will die first. If a hound will not be driven from a sick bed, the victim will die. In Jutland, a hound's stubborn howling betides a death in the direction the muzzle is pointed, and such a dog is called a corpse hound. Now, the belief that hounds can sense a human's forthcoming death may very well be based on a lot of observation. It has been shown lately that dogs can smell cancer, and in fact can diagnose it more efficiently than modern medical technology on some occasions. This may be the case with other conditions as well. For instance, a sickening diabetic's change in breath or body odor can often be sensed even by humans, let alone hounds. Even today, with all our best technology, doctors frequently use their senses of smell as diagnostic aids. For instance, you can smell particular smells of liver failure, of diabetic ketoacidosis, and a few other things. And when you consider how utterly pathetic the human sense of smell is compared to that of the dog, you can see how, they might have been absolutely splendid diagnostic instruments if we'd understood enough to find out what they were trying to tell us. As it was, we only got the crude impressions, such as when the dog realized that the person was reaching a metabolic state incompatible with life. It is also, however, likely that some of the death foretelling beliefs were particularly noticeable or also influenced by the older understanding of the hound's kinship to the wolf and the link of both of them as carrion eaters of a certain size to the dead. People living in a non-urban society, as I mentioned, could hardly help being aware of the canine urge to dig up bodies of all species, including humans, so it's no surprise that the eater of the dead should be seen as a foreseer of death. One could also compare, say, the understanding of a gathering of ravens and eagles as foretelling battle, which it probably did because there was probably a fair bit of learned behavior among the birds, particularly corvids, who learn, pass things on, and would easily have figured out that when they saw a lot of armed and armored humans clunking along, banging their shields and going, we're going to cut their tonkers off, that there was going to be a good feed shortly thereafter. In addition, the remarkable canine sense of smell enables hounds to sense even well-buried rotten flesh, which is wholly hidden from human senses. And it's a small step from finder and possibly eater of the dead to foreseer of death, not to mention the ancient Indo-Germanic view of the dog as devouring death, which I already mentioned. Otherworldly hounds appear with Odin when he leads the wild hunt or the woad host. In Denmark, the arrival of the woad host is known by the sound of its dogs, and it is said when dogs go mad, when they get rabies, that they have been bitten by the wild hunter's hounds. The hounds howling through the sky are also called hellhounds, and hearing them is an omen of plague or disaster. Both England, particularly the Danish settled areas, and Denmark have their share of ghost hounds. Cambridge is haunted, and still said to be haunted, by the black shuck, which is a huge black hound which precedes death. When I got there in the early 1990s, people were still telling stories about the black shuck, admittedly more in the way of quaint local folklore than in the way of don't dare to go out on a foggy night, but there you go, the legend is still alive and being passed on. Yorkshire folk tradition calls a similar hound the Grim, which is a term also used there for churchyard haunts, and quite possibly once stemming from Odin. Brundegard mentions quite a number of ghostly hounds in Danish belief, generally tied to murder sites. Like the hounds of the woad host or wild hunt, these dogs are most often black, are occasionally white with glowing eyes. Spectral black hounds often appear at the deaths of evildoers, possibly related to the quasi-Christian belief that the devil can take the form of a black dog, a pretty common belief in medieval Europe, which shows up, for instance, in Goethe's Faust. Mephistopheles, in fact, incarnates as a black poodle. I don't know if they had toy poodles in Goethe's day, but I've known a couple that I certainly would not disbelieve that they were some sort of Christian fiend. But the black dogs here may also show some older understanding of the hound as a death beast. Now, hounds, again, with this same duality between the outsider, the devourer, and the guardian, both ghostly and living hounds appear as How guardians. Hundehøj in Brande in Denmark is said to have been named Hound How, because whenever someone tried to dig in after treasure, their dogs would go mad and run away. A dog is said to have hindered the excavation of King Gorm's house in Jellinge, and when an effort to remove the burial mound Lyshøj in Blidstrup began, a black dog with burning eyes appeared in the garth, and whoever attempted to strike it fell sick. The dogs were also buried alive at thresholds to become guardians against both the returning dead and other threats of traditionally otherworldly origins, such as sickness. The common belief that hounds can see ghosts and other wights of the other world is, or at least was, particularly strong in Denmark. Dogs will howl when the Helhest, Hell's horse, passes by, the embodiment of plague, when the dead come back to their homes, when there is a witch nearby, or when otherworldly wights in general are about. Now, overall, this seems to be a pretty deeply rooted folk belief throughout the Germanic countries, which makes it a little odd when we look at the prose prologue to Grimnismal, because when the disguised Odin appears, Gerard's hounds don't bark at him, and Frigg has deceitfully warned the king to seize the stranger at whom the dogs will not bark. Now, it's perfectly possible that this stems from a Viking knowledge of the habits of the Norwegian elkhund and its type, who can only be suppressed from barking, I'm sure, by the strongest supernatural means. They're very good barkers. They've been bred for 9,000 years to be audible through miles of thick forest. And, well, they like to exercise their talent. They're very expressive. Or it's possible also that Gerard's hounds know and or obey the god who is the friend and leader of wolves, and hence, presumably, of hounds. In the Celtic world, dogs are very strongly linked with both death and healing, but the Germanic folks seem largely to have only seen the first of these. And this seems a little odd, as Odin was widely known as a healer throughout the Germanic world, as we see, for instance, with the Zweite Merseburger Zauberspruch, the English 9 Herbs charm, Hauvemal 147-148, and a number of other references, particularly in folk charms. However, I think that Odin's healing skills are a secondary understanding rising from his specific magical might rather than from his overall role of death god, in contrast to the chthonic healing deities of the Greeks, Romans, and Celts, such as Apollo and the various continental Celtic gods who were interpreted as Apollo thus and so us by the Romans, such as, for instance, Apollo Cunomagnus, Apollo Houndlord from Wiltshire in England. Cunomagnus himself is very likely to originally have been a Celtic god of healing who was linked with hounds, and easy to attach to Apollo, though you're always a bit out in dicey land when you're talking about Roman interpretation of other European deities. As with the Roman Mars Elodius, Mars Great Tree, who is stark naked, not a weapon in sight, not a separate weapon in sight, wearing nothing but a big smile and a big demonstration of the great tree part of the name.
Yes.
Not manifestly not really a battle god there. But anyway, it's interesting that the role of healer among the Germanic folks was chiefly, though never altogether womanly. It was mostly done by women for a lot of reasons. It wasn't one of those things, that a man would be called ergi or whatever for doing. Men who did it were respected, but mostly it was women who did it. But hounds are not mentioned, save for Idun or Air, though actually we know almost nothing about Air. We know very little about Idun except for the one tale. We know absolutely nothing about their cults. Nothing is mentioned about it, no place names, etc. Now, Mingrid does have two hounds, Gifur and Yeri, guarding her tree with its remedy for old age. However, their role here seems more likely to be the standard one of otherworldly or indeed Middlegarthly, since one often reflects the other kind of a guardian. I think the whole description there in Sveepdag's Maul should be seen as a rendition of the common motif, which we see at least from Kerberos northward, of the hounds that are always on watch and can only be passed by distracting them with a certain special food. This emphasizes Mingrid's otherworldly nature, and perhaps even an underworldly nature for her, and the value of her tree, but does not necessarily suggest any working link between the guardians and the healing nature of that which they guard. In fact, it's really very odd there that we don't see dogs more specifically as guardians against illness because of the persistent understanding that illness was in some way involved with evil wights attacking one, actually creeping in and physically invading one, what have you. And you'd think that dogs would be just the thing to help discourage that, in much the same way as Thor seems to have been the most important god of healing in practice, in at least what's recorded from the Germanic era. But there we are. Although Anne Sophie Gresslin does suggest strongly that the dogs which are so very common in Scandinavian graves from the migration through the end of the Viking Ages are not just the faithful companions of the dead, but should be regarded as important for the journey of the soul of the dead to the other world. The mythical dog, she suggests, seems to be a medium on the border between the living and the dead, and in all likelihood the archaeological material reflects this important symbolic mythological meaning in the transformation from life to death, which offers yet another possible look at the Kungsingen hound, that it wasn't just meant to help ward the woman with whom it was buried, but actually to help guide her to the other world, as well as warding her, just as an actual hound buried with her might have been able to lead her home if she were lost.
Wow, that's really fantastic. Well, that actually took not quite an hour. Is there anything else you'd like to say on the topic, or just experiences, reminiscences, anything interesting?
Well, I think possibly the best way to end this, since my previous chapters, which have been dealing with to a large extent the use of amulets and the interpretation of various pieces which might or might not be amulets, there is a wonderful, quite recent story, which is from modern Norway, involving a child traveling alone, a 13-year-old traveling alone, and a pack of wild wolves. This happened in January 2011. The kid was from Rockestad in Norway, which is fairly far north, I understand. His name was Walter Akrim, and he was walking home from school. That far north it gets dark real early, so here's this kid walking home from school, presumably through a bit of woods or something, and he realizes that he's got company. In fact, there are several large wild wolves sitting there looking at him, and possibly giving serious consideration to whether he might make a nice supper for them, to which he responded by turning up the music on his mobile phone as loud as he could, holding it up, light music and all, and as he described it, the wolves just turned around and trotted away. Now, the original reports of this story said that he was playing death rock at them. Actually, it was a band called Creed, who I think are not actually a death rock band. But if one were looking back at second-hand renditions of this from 1,000 years' distance, it would be awfully tempting to say something along the lines of the apocryphal death rock, identifying its player as himself an Odinic figure, and hints warded from the god's beasts.
That's a great story, I think, and it also really ties together the past with the present. Well, I want to thank you for being with us this evening, and we'll look forward to having you again soon, and we talk about probably yet another animal or another topic.
I look forward to coming back. I'm happy to continue the theme of symbolic animals for a while. We've got a lot of them. Or if the show hears from enough people who are interested in something else, we can go there too.
Yeah, remember you can write me and Kvelduflr at Melodi Reader, that's MELODIREADER@gmail.com, and we can't promise to answer all your questions, but we will take a look at them. Thanks again for joining us this evening, and we look forward to seeing you next time here at Cat's Eye on the Future. That's a wrap. Okay. You have been listening to Cat's Eye on the Future, the show where we take a look at what's coming up in your world and your future. Join us again next time for another episode of Cat's Eye on the Future.